Start streaming. Am I live? Hey, look at that. I'm live. Yo, okay. Today I am having some fun and it's going to be just me. Kind of realized I don't really know how to do this. So I'm going to make this big screen. But we're going to go through Metaphysics by Aristotle. And I'm just going to read it into the void. And that's about it. Parentis optimus. This means like, thanks mom and dad. Yeah. Let's get into it. I bought this book. I don't know if this is like how this goes because um you know with like the rights and books and all that sort of thing. It's a very old book, but the translation isn't old. So I don't know if that counts as me breaking the rules or whatever. But we'll find out. We'll find out. Let me change this to reading Metaphysics live by Aristotle live. Save. Category then would be philosophy, I guess, but it should be education? I don't know. I'm gonna make it, I'm just gonna leave it as is. As you can see, I have no idea what I'm doing. I was wondering if I can get this chat on a different um, like device. That way I can, um, somehow see the chat. I'm just going to stream on my phone. That should be the way to do it. And then my chat will be super delayed, but hey, at least I've got the chat up. Alrighty, let's get into it. Preface. There are no doubt some books of which it can be justly claimed that they will both prove invaluable for the new student and be a source of stimulation for experienced readers. This is not such a book. Indeed, I have doubts about the extent to which such a work can be produced on the subject at any rate of Aristotelian metaphysics. We might have a metaphysics hater here. Mr. Translator might not like metaphysics. Forced, therefore, into choosing between an exoteric or an esoteric translation of the metaphysics, I have compiled with the constraints of time and of the limitations of my own competence in seeking to address myself orbi rather than urbi. The result, I hope, will be useful. If humble rung on the Wittgensteinian ladder up which anyone seeking to become acquainted with Aristotle's central ruminations on the substance of the world must climb. That was a word salad. I don't know what he's on about. 3 brief acknowledgements. I would like to express my gratitude to the philosophy department of Birkbeck College, to whom I am indebted for an extraordinary amount of philosophical stimulation and encouragement over the last 10 years. During the course of making this translation, I became a husband and a father. This experience has caused me to wonder whether Aristotle may exaggerate the importance of what persists through any change, An older debt of similar nature is acknowledged by the dedication. Excuse me, I'm just going to make sure I can actually if there's an easier way for me to read the chat, because if so, I would like that. I don't think there is. That's okay. We're going to get through this. Substance. What is the purpose of studying metaphysics? And what is the purpose of studying the metaphysics? By the way, from this dedication, I think this guy doesn't really like metaphysics. I don't think he's very, very fond of metaphysics, which is kind of gay, but what can you do? I think metaphysics as a concept is really cool. I think the idea that, you can study reality in such a way is neat. But at any rate, what can you do, Alright, introduction, substance. What is the purpose of studying metaphysics? And what is the purpose of studying the metaphysics? It has been argued in the 20th century and before, with great force, elegance, and coherence, that there is no point in studying either, and indeed that the temptation to take seriously the latter, and perhaps also the former, can only be a source of deep philosophical perplexity. On the other hand, in previous philosophical epochs, metaphysics was routinely regarded as the pinnacle of philosophical speculation, and the metaphysics was effectively taken to be its founding character. There have been many great thinkers for whom the most important question in philosophy has been what response we should make to the claims of metaphysicians in general and of Aristotle in particular. Of course, we cannot tell the value of metaphysics until we have agreed what it is, nor that of the metaphysics until its central doctrines are at least provisionally familiar. In this introduction, I say a little about the ambitions and limitations of metaphysical thinking, and then try to show why Aristotle's treatise should be considered a paradigm of such thinking. Whatever attitude we come to take to its central claims, I also broach two other topics. The first concerns the particular nature of the metaphysics as a composition, some would say a compilation. The general architecture of this work is fraught with problems, and there are intriguing and important issues about just how the text that we have before us came into being. The second topic I discuss is the nature and purpose of the present translation. If I remember correctly, with metaphysics, like and Aristotle in general, what happened was you had the ancient Greeks who wrote down everything about Aristotle, and they all more or less preserved the text, and then during the Dark Ages, like after the fall of Rome, a lot of these texts were lost, but they were preserved by the Arabs and the Muslims, and then they were reintroduced back into Europe by Islamic philosophy and translation of Arabic books. So it's a pretty convoluted path to take, going from like Greek to Byzantine to Arabic, then back into Latin, which I think it would make the composition pretty not good. Many philosophers, conspicuously, including Aristotle, as we shall see, have held the view that the understanding of anything either depends on or is profoundly facilitated by obtaining the correct definition of it at the start of one's investigation. That's fair, in my opinion. If this is right, then it seems certainly that we cannot reach understanding of philosophy itself, and certainly not of metaphysics. Many attempts have been made to put into a nutshell of the core project of. I don't agree with this. This is silly. You need a definition before you start investigating something. Well, if that's true, then you can't investigate anything because why? What a silly goober. Coffee. Many attempts have been made to put into a nutshell the core project of the metaphysician, but severely and collectively they severally and collectively they serve only to show that the subject is too elusive and strange to be pinned down in any manageable way. The nature of metaphysics can only be indicated, if at all, by suggestion rather than stipulation. Okay, so in this introduction we're getting a pretty strong opinion about our guy here, which is that the translator doesn't like metaphysics as a subject. I think he thinks it's too, there's no empirical evidence, therefore you can't do anything with it type of guy. That's my guess, but we'll keep reading. And perhaps the best way to suggest its nature is to contrast it with other forms of inquiry, especially with science. Yeah, I was so right. There's no empirical evidence for metaphysics, so actually, it's not as good. You can't really know anything about it. I wonder how he feels about um, the fact that science is based off of metaphysical presuppositions. Because obviously, if science is based off metaphysical presuppositions, then you kind of can't compare science to metaphysics because science relies on metaphysics. The nature the nature of science itself is hardly perspicuous. I do not know how to spell that word.
Perspicuous.
Perspicuous. New word. We learnt a new word today. Perspicuous. It will perhaps be agreed that science attempts to clarify the structure and process of our world through the patient observation of its sensible phenomena, and the cautious or bold construction of hypotheses that are in some way answerable to such observations. The conclusions of science are provisional, their confirmation holistically sensitive to the repercussions of events across the whole range of our experience. The sensitivity of the conclusions of science seems ambiguous and has always been taken in two ways, either as an indication that the scientist is responding to a pattern outside himself to which he must constantly adjust his assumptions, or as a reason of deep skepticism about the capacity of the whole enterprise to deliver a convincing picture of the world. If the latter attitude is adapted to the evolving image that science offers, then this can either be the occasion of a more comprehensive skepticism, which holds that there are, quite generally, severe restrictions on the understanding that we can have in any way of our predicament, or at least the desire to seek some more secure and therefore fundamental form of knowledge about the world, which will not be thus vulnerable to the fluctuations of theoretical fashion, which would be metaphysics. This desire is the point of departure for the metaphysics. What the metaphysician is after is a comprehensive account of how the world is, and that is somehow immune to the uncertainties overshadowing all our reflections on the cause and content of our experience. The metaphysician wants to understand the world once and for all, but how is such understanding to be obtained? Well, two ways in which the world may be available to non-scientific comprehension are that advocated by the religious believer, who may well be disposed to acknowledge absolute moral values, and that of the mystic, who may also be unusually sensitive to aesthetic experience. The believer standardly lays claim to an understanding of the world that is based on the revelations of a higher person, and the mystic will insist that certain episodes or aspects of his or her experience are endowed with a value or significance that gives him or her the authority to make. I feel like that's a bit of a straw man. I get what he's saying. Like, yeah, religious people do um, rely on, appealing to their religious scripture or appealing to their religion to make claims, and mystics do rely on mystical experience to make claims, and that's all well and good, but that's not like holistically what these religions are about. It's not that simple. It's not that basic. Neither of these approaches is necessarily incompatible with the project of metaphysics, but neither are they constitutive of it. They both purport to provide the kind of knowledge that the metaphysician wants, but they go about it in ways that are not his. Well, it's kind of interesting reading this because maybe this guy, doesn't know about people like Thomas Aquinas or whoever the Muslim equivalent of Thomas Aquinas is, because, with metaphysics, they've been pretty conducively married into the theology of Islam and Christianity. So, if you're a Muslim, or a Christian, chances are there's some theologian in your tradition who's gone over very systematically and philosophically metaphysics. What is the distinctive of metaphysics? What is distinctive of metaphysics is that it is, like science, a rational project. What this means is that the metaphysician purports to give grounds for his large conclusions that are not founded either on appeal to divine authority or on a claim to experience of a privileged kind. Yeah, see, it's just like, that's not fair. Because if you read something like Summa Contra Gentiles, which I'm planning on reading and doing a review on eventually, you would see that most religions have people who are philosophers in the religion who will argue the religion on the grounds of logic, and metaphysics. One book I'm actually definitely going to read before Summa Contra Gentiles is Treatise on the First Principle by Duns Scotus. So that should be fun, that should be interesting. What is distinctive of metaphysics? I've already read that bit. Here we go. The metaphysician aspires and pretends to reach his conclusions by logical arguments commencing from assumptions which would be readily accepted by any reasonable person. From the pig's ear of our experience, he fashions the silk purse of his vision of the cosmos. Kant, for instance, starts from the truism that our experience contains particular phenomena between which our minds see general patterns, and concludes that the world that we know is the product of the interaction of occult faculties which are constitutive of our subjectivity, and that the world in itself is utterly beyond our scrutiny. Russell notes, that's Bertrand Russell and Immanuel Kant, by the way. I do want to read those guys at some point, but there's so much to read. Russell notes that many sentences of ordinary language are compositions of simpler sentences with independent meanings of their own, and concludes that the world must ultimately be made up of atomic units whose mutual disconnection is not a chance of nature, but a logical necessity. Plato remarks that the descriptions that we give of objects in our world are usually in some way relative to the context of presentation, and he passes from this to the conclusion that reality consists of a world of eternal and unchanging entities, of which the world we know is merely a pale reflection, and so on. Always the process is the same. Input is simple, even banal features of our daily dealings with the world. The output, an extraordinary and dramatic reassessment of the fundamental structure of the world. The metaphysician, then, is open to the objection that even we concede the desirability of the sort of knowledge that he seeks. His pretensions to deliver such knowledge are preposterous. After all, someone with no philosophical commitments might think it is not at all obvious that the claims of a religious believer or a mystic cannot be true. For all diversity and contrariety of such claims, but it seems excessively implausible that mere rumination on some of the more elementary features of our quotidian experience. That's a word I've never read before. Quotidian, occurring every day, daily. Quotidian experience could lead to a profound revelation of our conception of the universe. It is, why not? Why does it seem excessively implausible? I think this guy's just a metaphysics hater, to be honest. This guy seems like a big metaphysics hater. It is at this point that consideration of nature of it is at this point that consideration of the nature of metaphysics intersects with that of its value. The gap between the premises of metaphysical arguments and the conclusions is indeed characteristically stupendous, and the probability that those conclusions are in any sense right or in any way illuminating is no doubt infinitesimal. It is indeed very plausible to suppose that the critics are right to object that something fundamental is wrong with the entire project, that the urge to metaphysics is a chimera bred of the failure to discern the workings of our conceptual scheme, our language. The history of philosophy is the history of the shift of confidence away from the possibility of direct insight into the world, first towards that of insights into the mind of the knowing subject, and latterly towards the insights into the logical structure of language. Such objections have dominated the philosophical stage of the century that is shortly to end. Yeah, you can see this guy. I'm not trying to be like a goober here, some like contrarian, but this guy clearly doesn't agree with metaphysics as a subject, and I think that's kind of stupid because all worldviews have metaphysical claims that they make, even if the metaphysical claim is that there is no metaphysics, right? So this guy would be still having to play the metaphysics game. Mr. Translator will still have to play the metaphysics game because metaphysics, you still have to argue for and against it. But that means that, like, even if you're to be one of those guys who only trusts in science, science makes metaphysical claims, right? It presupposes things about reality that you can't know empirically. So then you have to rely on philosophy in order to make science valid in the first place. You know what I mean? So yeah, it's kind of goofy, I think. Such objections have dominated the philosophical stage of the century that is shortly to end. Yet it is a remarkable fact that at the end of it, sympathy for the project of metaphysics is as great as perhaps it has ever been. The great metaphysicians of the past, none more than Aristotle, are studied with minute care, and the connections between their thinking and that of contemporary philosophers are matters of intense discussion. This is indeed remarkable, but we need not look far for an explanation. It lies in the fact that the great metaphysical systems contain deep and fascinating philosophical arguments, the value of which in no way depends on their logical validity, no less on their correctness of the premises. So yeah, he's basically just going off about like, well, you can read it because it's fun, but not because it has any meaning. Anselm, that's Saint Anselm, by the way. I think of Canterbury. Saint Anselm celebrated ontological argument for the existence of God, once dismissed as a monstrous humbug, is now subjected to rigorous dissection. Descartes' often ridiculed claim that I think therefore I am still baffles the intellectual heirs of Frege and Wittgenstein. I don't know what those mean. The history of metaphysics is a history of magnificent failures. This guy is such a hater of metaphysics. And it is their magnificence that we now remember and revere. Their failure that is buried with their bones. I think I'm going to give my own take on why I think nowadays metaphysics is studied more than ever. It isn't because metaphysics is somehow dead and because it's dying people are like interested in it anymore. I think what's happened, especially over the last few years, like you look at someone like Alex O'Connor. I think he's a good example of this. People have sort of realized that a purely materialistic worldview is inadequate at explaining reality. So now they're turning to metaphysics to supplement their materialist positions, because you need them, basically. You can't just rely on science to understand the world. And people are kind of waking up to that, I guess. That's my opinion. I don't think it's just like people find it interesting or fun. I think it's being tackled again because people sort of come out of the other side of the materialist worldview, especially in Western countries. I think it's people are going back to things that they dismissed and kind of going, oh wow, this stuff is actually kind of valid. Let's now turn to Aristotle. Even if we allow that there is value in the study of metaphysics, irrespective of the status of its conclusions, why Aristotle? Why a thinker who's been dead for 2,300 years and who has frequently been stigmatized, even demonized, as an impediment to natural growth of human knowledge, to the natural growth of human knowledge and understanding? This is really a historical question, and to answer it one must give a little of the historical background to Aristotle's achievement. By the time that Aristotle started to think about philosophy, the subject was already nearly 200 years old. It had begun with the attempts of various remarkable and apparently isolated thinkers in Ionia, the Aegean coast of modern Turkey, to generalize about the commonalities that underlie the changing appearance of physical things. If things as apparently diverse as a cloud and a plant have water in common, then maybe, they reasoned, there is something that all the entities we encounter have in common, something which is therefore the stuff of the world. This search for a world stuff dominated the first century of the development of philosophy. I've never read any like pre-Socratic philosophers, so I would have no clue if this guy is talking out of his butt or not. But I'm going to take his word for it, because why not? But in the middle of the 5th century BC, the Athenian Empire threatened to swallow up the whole of the Greek world. The course of philosophical speculation was dramatically and permanently changed by 3 men: Heraclitus of Ephesus, Parmenides of Elea, and Socrates of Athens. Heraclitus and Parmenides probably never met, and may well have been ignorant of each other's existence, yet taken together their work constitutes the first serious threat to the common sense notion that the world is broadly speaking as we take it to be, the doctrine that philosophers label naive realism. Heraclitus pointed tentatively towards the skeptical notion that since we cannot absolutely trust all our senses all the time, we can never really trust them any of the time. Things that appear to be solid and more or less permanent are in fact constantly undergoing gradual change, always slowly becoming something else, never merely being something fixed and set. Thus, whereas we think that we are surrounded by a world of things, we are in fact immersed in a ceaseless flux, with no underlying structure or nature that we might hope to grasp. These thoughts were radical and no doubt not well understood. War and the loss of the Athenian Empire, and, for a brief time, the democracy. It is also well known that in the last 2 decades of his life, the period of his greatest creativity, he came to be surrounded by an eager coterie. I don't know what that word is. Coterie?
Coterie.
Coterie. A coterie, small, intimate, enough exclusive group. So, an eager coterie of acolytes, fascinated by his ruthless technique of cross-examination and his unflinching determination to follow the consequences of an argument. It is also well known that one of these acolytes was Plato. Plato built the metaphysical system from which Socrates was distracted by his more directly ethical concerns. At some point, possibly during his 10 years of travel in the aftermath of the execution of Socrates, possibly while establishing in Athens after his return that institution which was intended to vindicate his mentor's name and develop and propagate his thought, Plato achieved a remarkable synthesis. He combined Heraclitean distrust of the world of the senses with a Parmenidean faith in the capacities of pure reason, and the Socratic conviction that whatever is right. The result was the theory of forms. The theory of forms is a theory that can be extracted from the masterpieces of Plato's middle period, especially in the great dialogues, the Meno, the Phaedo, the Republic, the Symposium, and the Phaedrus. I actually bought the Republic a long time ago, and it's been sitting on my bookshelf for quite some time. I do plan on eventually reading that too, but we'll see. I actually have a uni degree that I need to do, so there's that. The theory doubtless emerged through the paths that were tortuous and perplexed, and which we cannot hope to retrace, and it may well have been taken seriously by its author for only a relatively short section of his philosophical career. Perhaps it was never taken really seriously by him at all. The theory holds that the objects of our familiar world, including our own bodies, have no real existence at all. They are merely a strange pseudo-existence reflections of the true realities, eternally existing and unchanging entities, which lie behind and, in some way, ground all the features and properties of the world that we know. These forms, as we call them, are perpetually unchanging, and indeed wholly outside the world of space and time. They are completely inaccessible to sensory apprehension of any kind, but we can, through the use of our intellect, achieve a measure of communion with them. The purpose of all philosophy and science is to exhibit the workings of the forms. And this is also the core of the morality and the happy life, since it is in knowledge of the forms that knowledge of how act consists. The theory of forms is now entrusted with the long history of reactions and abreactions to it that it is impossible for us to re-experience in imagination the impact that it must at first have had. Widely dismissed by the many as alarming evidence of insanity in its author, it must have been embraced by the few with that intellectual passion that is felt only by those whose conviction is sharpened by the exhilaration of doctrinal isolation. By the mid-360s, when Plato's Academy was probably some 20 years old, that institution must have been full of fervent converts to the contemplative reverence and a supersensible perfection. It was into this institution that a 17-year-old Aristotle was plunged. There was no prospect of there being any end to the debate about how young Aristotle reacted to Platonism. Discussion has raged across the 20th century, and at the end of it, two views continue to provide the central focus. The first, that Aristotle became himself for a time a convinced adherent of this new secular religion, and that gradually thereafter his faith elapsed until he came to cherish the immediate and particular in a way that he could not have done without his idealistic aberration. The other is that Aristotle immediately and very strongly reacted against Platonism, that he at once set about the task of showing that the reality of the world cannot rest on such remote entities as the forms, that we must make sense of the idea that what lies around us is indeed the foundation of the world. It might be thought that such dissidence would not be tolerated in the Academy, where, after all, Aristotle remained for more than 20 years. But it is at least clear that this is wrong. The author of the intellectual tyranny of the Republic was a passionate defender of doctrinal pluralism in the administration of his own school. The pattern of development of Aristotle's thought. Hold on. Let's not get ahead of ourselves here. I actually think it's true. Plato probably was the type of guy who was willing to debate because God only knows how, but he put up with Diogenes for ages. He was putting up with Diogenes for so long. And Diogenes certainly didn't agree with Plato. So the idea that he would probably tolerate Aristotle debating him, being like a contrarian in his own school, yeah, that checks out, I think, from the little knowledge I have. Let's continue. The pattern of the development of Aristotle's thought, then, remains hotly controversial, even in its broadest outlines. But no serious student would dispute that Aristotle's agenda is to a large extent that of Plato. It is impossible to understand Aristotle's philosophical project without realizing that he thought that it was of central importance to get clear about the theory of forms, or the philosophical stance that it embodies. Okay, and it is, I think, impossible to read Aristotle with sympathy and profit without sharing some of his fascination with the thought that the fundamental structure of the world is ideal, not natural. Hold on, what? Yeah, okay, so he's like, yeah, okay. I'm a bit confused with this paragraph, but because from what I understand, uh, the world is natural according to Aristotelian philosophy. So Aristotle probably isn't, you know, some guy who's like Plato and it's all about Idealism? I don't know, but we'll find out in a small moment. That Aristotle is a critic of idealism, albeit in many ways was a sympathetic one. It is clear, but it is no less important to see that he is a severe critic of unreconstructed materialism. That's true. Like pure, there's, I think you have to kind of give credence to the fact that I think a pure materialism as a philosophy, that everything is just matter and motion, is untenable, but like the radical idealism of someone like Plato is completely, it's on the opposite spectrum. It's also untenable because once you get that far down, it becomes basically impossible to substantiate your claims or to build a coherent worldview. Um, Basically, just because you reject so much that it becomes impossible to make it make sense. We are perhaps so adjusted to thinking of materialism as a relative latecomer in the history of ideas, if we mean by materialism the philosophical view that the world is made up of matter and force and absolutely nothing else, that it is easy for us to overlook the fact that in Aristotle's intellectual context, materialism was a hello. Blah 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 blah. Am I back? Yeah, I'm back, baby. Alright, let's continue. So, yeah, my headphones ran out of battery, if you're wondering, because I still have headphones with batteries in them. So, natural is it for us to see the development of philosophy as leading to Athenian rationalism and its aftermath that we forget that in the Aegean world, the task of explaining the world continued to be focused on the elucidation of its material constituents. The attempt to inventorize the material of the world, which was, as we have seen in many ways, the point of departure for philosophy as a whole, was not abandoned, as it might have been in the face of the logical challenge from Ephesus and Elea. I don't know where Elea is. Rather than whither materialism evolved into new and more sophisticated forms. The form of materialism with which Aristotle was most familiar, and which loomed largest on the philosophical stage that he knew, was that of atomism. This remarkable doctrine seems to have been first launched by Leucippus of Abdera on the northern Aegean coast. What a goofy ass name, bro. And he's just dropping materialism before it was cool. On the northern coast, not far from Aristotle's birthplace of Stagirus, and then greatly developed and extended by his disciple Democritus of the same city. Our knowledge of theory is filtered through the writings of later adherents, notably the versification by the extraordinary Roman poet T. Lucretius Carus of the version of the theory espoused by the Hellenistic thinker Epicurus. I know about Epicureanism, that's hedonism. Whereas we can be reasonably confident that Lucretius does not deviate far in doctrine from his Greek master, it is less easy to say how close Epicurus is to the details of Democritus's atomism. The central idea of the theory, however, is clear. It is a response to the challenge of Parmenides objected that we cannot say of anything that it both is and is not. Parmenides didn't like the law of non-contradiction? Zam. Very well then, says Democritus, let us divide the world into what is and what is not. We can call the former matter and the latter void. Okay, maybe I misunderstood. Can say anything that it both is and is not. Okay, no, he does agree with the law of non-contradiction. Yeah, we can call the former matter and the latter void. Still, we can reconstruct about the diversity of the contents of the world by supposing that matter takes the form of tiny particles of undifferentiated content, but widely differing in shape, which are susceptible of indefinite combination into the ordered structures that we observe. On this basis, we can explain order as a product of statistical regularity without needing to bring any such dubious agency as Anaxagoras' mind. This guy's dropping names that I don't even know. I have no idea who Anaxagoras is, but cool. Yeah, atomism, that seems neat. I heard like his theory with like was kind of funny because like he thought there was tiny metal atoms and they had hooks on them and that's why metal is so strong or something like that. There is no doubt that Democritus's atomism was widely appreciated and admired among thinkers of the 4th century BC. It was of course flagrantly at odds with any kind of Platonism, and so far as we can tell most philosophers tended to orientate themselves very clearly towards one or the other of these apparently exclusive alternatives. What is distinctive about Aristotle is that, no doubt, any combination of reasons of temperament and circumstance, he attempted a kind of synthesis or compromise between the two positions. In this respect, he can perhaps be compared with the more recent and thus familiar case of Kant, who similarly saw himself as achieving a historic reconciliation between the insights of empiricism and rationalism. The tension between Platonic idealism and Democritean materialism set the stage for the development of Aristotle's thought, but we cannot hope now to reconstruct with confidence the precise plot of the drama. It seems likely that Aristotle's ideas were forming during the first 30, perhaps even 40 years of his life, and that he inclined at various times towards the materialist, now towards the idealist perspective before reaching his final remarkable synthesis, or syntheses as we shall see. It is unlikely that we will ever know for certain more than this, but my own feeling is that Aristotle's development up to the time at which he left the Academy after the death of Plato in 347 BC went approximately as follows. Okay, we've had a philosophic history lore dump in this amazing introduction, and now we get the awesome Aristotle lore dump, which begs the question: how long does the lore dump go? Oh my gosh. No way is it like 40 pages. Oh, it is! It's 50 pages long. Bro, this is crazy. Hold on. Can you guys see this? It's 50 pages long. I'm the only one in the call. Why am I saying you guys? I'm the only one here. Anyway, this His early years were dominated by the intellectual climate of the North Aegean in general, and by his father's profession in particular. As we have already seen, the Aegean basin, and perhaps especially its northern littoral, had always tended to produce thinkers of a relatively hard-headed and materialistic outlook. It tended to be in the West that philosophers dreamed of an ideal order transcending the mundanities mundanities of our imperfect world, and in the East that the spirit of mechanistic explanation, even of animate phenomena, was most pervasive. This involved, to a particular extent, the profession of Aristotle's father, Nicomachus. I wonder if that has something to do with ethics being called Nicomachean ethics. Because I actually don't know why it's called the Nicomachean ethics. I never bothered to read that bit. Which was that of medicine. Oh, Zed was a doctor. The history of Greek medicine is that of an institution of caste-like and exclusive character, which nevertheless was prepared to tolerate radical innovation and a critical attitude to accepted practices that would have been praised by Sir Karl Popper. I don't know who that is. The medical profession in ancient Greece was a profession that one joined not by formal qualification but by birth. All doctors claimed to be descendants of the legendary or mythical Asclepius. I wonder if there's a photo of Asclepius. Greek god of medicine. Okay. Fair enough. I'm also descended from that guy. I've just decided. Why not? And membership of his descent group was, it seems, not only unnecessary but also, in the normal way, a sufficient cause for membership of the profession. Thus Aristotle would, from his earliest awareness, have known that his destined profession was to be what his destined profession was to be, and he would no doubt have sensed the prestige attached to the itinerant, I don't know how to pronounce this word,
itinerant,
itinerant Asclepiad doctors, and the cult of secrecy that tended to surround their art. But he would also, we assume, have known of the bold and speculative writings that had been produced by the membership of the medical guild, writings which have come traditionally to be attached to the name of Hippocrates of Seos. He may well have been brought up to think that speculation of the inner workings of natural processes, far from being an affront to religious susceptibilities, was actually a pious recognition of the wishes of Asclepius for his successors and their heirs. In assessing the influence on Aristotle of Nicomachus and the medical profession, we must take into account that his father died when Aristotle was merely 10 years old, whereas this probably weakened his direct connection with practicing doctors, and perhaps with his own predetermination for a medical career. It may well have given a special place in his feelings to the naturalistic perspective that was at the heart of Greek medicine. Damn, Aristotle's got crazy backstory. His education between the ages of 10 and 17 was of the conventional Hellenizing kind, favored by the states that stood within the penumbra of the Greek world proper. This would no doubt have given him a reverence of a kind for Athens and everything associated with it, which would have had some influence on his state of mind when he was dispatched by his father's former employer, the king of Macedon, to study in Plato's academy. Entering the academy in the late 360s, he would have encountered idealist metaphysics in full cry, and it is certainly possible that he fell immediately under its spell. It has often been pointed out that in the period of his stay in the academy he wrote several works for popular consumption of an overtly Platonizing nature. It is unlikely that these were merely an exercise of routine pieces of institutional propaganda. He seems to have lavished on them his rhetorical gifts, which had no doubt been sharpened by his tutors in Macedon, and the fragments that have survived suggest a powerful emotional identification with the aspirations of the theory of forms, as well as mastery of the arguments on which the theory was held to rest. He did not, and this is crucial in the greatness of his own system, merely dismiss the perspective of idealism with the animus that scientifically minded philosophers have often felt against it. Right. Um, yeah, I suppose. It's kind of interesting reading about this because, like, you know, when you hear about someone like Aristotle, it's pretty easy to just um, think of Aristotle as like just a guy, you know what I mean? Like or that he's like some amorphous person. You kind of forget that he is actually a person, right? He was a person who was real and existed, and he had a life and all that. I don't know. When I hear Aristotle, I just think of like the ideas. I don't think of the person behind them, really. So it's kind of interesting to read this. It seems likely that perhaps by the late 340s, when he had been in the academy for some 10 years, he was coming to see that a reconciliation of some kind had been effected between the science of nature, especially as it related to living things, for which it is clear that he felt an extraordinary attraction, and the more abstract reflections that seemed to point away from the reality of the world of the senses towards a quite different ultimate structure of the world. It is the fact that he achieved this reconciliation with such mastery, and in a way so palatable to common sense and to perennial philosophical institutions, that has made his system, for all its obscurities and even occasional absurdities, the intellectual foundation for the received metaphysics of the Western world. Yeah, I mean, the fact that the Roman Catholic Church, even to this day, its mainstream theology is Thomism, right? And Thomism is essentially just Aristotle repackaged with Catholic doctrine, right? So yeah, he's had a massive effect on the history of science in the world. Sort of a underappreciated effect, I guess. It is best, I think, to see Aristotle's philosophy as being dominated by three questions. What is being, and what are the things that are? How can the things that undergo the changes that we see, how can the things that undergo the changes that we see all around us in nature? How can the things that are how can the things that are undergo the changes that we see all around us in nature? Oh my gosh, I had a brain fart reading that. How can the world be understood? It is, of course, true that his thinking covers a vast range of other major topics in the formal, empirical, and philosophical domains. Yeah, I'm never going to read rhetoric or the physics, I don't think, for this reason. Like, yeah, he talked about a lot of things, but you probably shouldn't care about the things that aren't related to metaphysics or ethics or like, um, yeah, just those two things really. Politics is a close runner-up. I've read Politics, as I've a small review of it on my channel. Um, it was a good book, I think. I think he's underrated even today. I think people should still be reading Aristotle today. But he would have regarded these other topics as being dependent upon and in some way secondary to ones that I have given in a way that was not reciprocal. I would agree. I would agree with this position like that Aristotle has, right? Because if you are as a philosopher, if you are being like, oh, I believe in, you know, this moral doctrine, right? I hold this moral position. That's all well and good, but if your underlying logic, if your underlying worldview doesn't correlate, if it doesn't accept that, then you're sort of cooked. You're sort of stuck. It needs to be able to accept that in order for you to have a holistically sensible worldview. So it's just a question of internal consistencies. Your baseline presuppositions must be uh, coherent with the logical conclusions you hold. It is, in any case, these three questions that dominate his metaphysical theory. But if we wish to understand how he answers these questions in his mature metaphysics, contained in the central books of the Metaphysics, we must first look briefly at two other major works, the Categories and the Physics. I've never heard of the Categories. Is that actually a book by him? Has it been translated by Penguin? The Categories by Aristotle. Oh, it is a book by Aristotle. Would you look at that? We got Internet Classics. It doesn't look like it's been translated by our mates over at Penguin, which is a shame. Text from Organon that enumerates all the kinds of things that can be the subject or the predicate of a proposition. They are perhaps the single most heavily discussed of all Aristotelian notions. The work is brief enough to be divided into books, as is usual with Aristotle's work, but into 15 chapters. Catalogs. Oh, okay, that's cool. I did not know that this book even existed. So people have Kant did one, the Stoics have done it. Yeah, okay. That's cool. I do want to read Prior Analytics by Aristotle too, because that seems like an interesting book. I think it's more about logic, this one, you know. But yeah, maybe for another day. Maybe for another day. We'll get back to what we were arguing or reading, not arguing. We must first look at briefly two other works, the Categories and the Metaphysics, which constitute the preliminary stages of his metaphysical view, whether earlier stages in its evolution or preparatory contributions to his presentation. Can I say this? This isn't my fault. Like, no, it's not people's fault, rather. Sorry, wrong way around. If that's the case, I've been reading Aristotle exactly the wrong way from the beginning. Because, as far as I understand, politics is a quote-unquote sequel to ethics. You're meant to read ethics before you read politics. And metaphysics, you're meant to read metaphysics and de anima before you read ethics. So far I've been unintentionally constantly reading Aristotle in the wrong order, which is just fun, I guess. I don't know. Either way, let's smash this out. In the categories, Aristotle sets out the range of things that are itemizing the inventory, sorry, of being. This is the philosophical study of ontology, the attempt to say that things have being. The task is, of course, not the of listing all the things that are in the world, a patently futile and impossible endeavor. Rather, it is that of saying what sorts of things have being and what sort of things do not. For instance, a physical object have being. For instance, a physical object have being, a sound, a color, a belief, a number, a flame, a memory, an event. Yeah. I know like one thing that comes up with the problem of evil is the fact that um, when people talk about the problem of evil, ontologically, technically, evil doesn't exist because evil is considered a privation of the good. So, yeah, like I guess reading this would be an important thing to read. Yeah. Anyway, a central ambition of the ontologist is to give an answer for every sensible question of this kind and for those that he does not consider sensible, to show why they are not sensible. But the ontologist may not be content even when he has given his catalogue of onta, of things that have being. He may also hold that the first sight, rather obscure belief, that the things that have being in different ways, and he may further hold that there is a kind of structure and hierarchy in the different ways in which things can have being. And if he does this, he may well attach a special significance to those things that have being in the way that seems to be in some sense at the foundation of this structure. Now all of these descriptions of the ontologists project apply to Aristotle, both in the categories and in the metaphysics. Okay, I'm going to go on a little side quest here, but what is the physics about? Because when I saw that there was a book called Physics by Aristotle, I thought it was actually just physics, but ancient Greek physics. You know, lectures on nature is a name text. Meaning of physics in Aristotle. It is a collection of treatises or lessons that deals with the most general philosophical principle of natural or moving things, both living and non-living. Rather than physical theories in the modern sense, our investigations of the particular contents of the universe. The chief purpose of this work is to discover the principles and causes and not merely to describe change or movement or motion, especially that of natural wholes, mostly living things, but also inanimate wholes like the cosmos. In the conventional Andronichian ordering of Aristotle's works, it stands at the head as well as being the foundation to the long series of physical, cosmological, biological treatises, whose ancient Greek title, The Writings of Nature or Natural Philosophy. Ha! Cool! I have been reading I've been successfully reading unintentionally Aristotle in the wrong order my whole time I started reading Aristotle. Aristotle thinks that there is indeed a diversity of things that have being, and that this diversity does indeed form a hierarchy. And he pays special attention to the foundational element of that hierarchy. In the categories, he argues that there are 10 kinds of beings that have being. Number 10 is suspiciously neat in such a context. one of Aristotle's colleagues in the Academy is said to have written a hymn to it, and the details of Aristotle's list are not particularly illuminating. What is crucial for Aristotle is the contrast between the first of his categories of things that are and the 9 others, for he holds the first category, substance, is indeed fundamental to the being of all others, which are thus non-reciprocally dependent upon it. To see why he thinks this, we need consider only one of his other categories, that of quality, the second category. Yeah, okay, this is getting interesting. I guess this is a good thing about modern books, right? Is, you can pick up most modern translations of a work, and if you actually bother to read the introduction, it'll give you all the relevant information you need to understand the book as best as possible. We're almost halfway through this introduction, but like, I'm not saying this in a mean way, but this introduction to Aristotle, like the introduction to the book, is, I think, as long as the Communist Manifesto. Manifesto length. Yeah, it's longer than the Communist Manifesto. So, by a pretty good margin too. So, like, that goes to show how well people are getting when it comes to writing introductions to books, and like, I think it's a good thing. I think it's cool. Aristotle holds that substances are things that have qualities, or conversely, qualities are things that belong to substance. If, for instance, the man Socrates is a substance, and being musical is a quality, then Socrates may have the quality of being musical, or the quality of being musical may belong to Socrates. Both Socrates and the quality of being musical are things that have being, but they have being in radically different ways. The former has being as a substance, the latter as a quality. And this means that the former is more fundamental, and, as Aristotle puts it, prior to the latter. Why is this so? Aristotle's answer is that the being of the quality depends upon that of the substance, but the being of substance does not depend on that of the quality. The thought is that Socrates need not have had the quality of musicality, but the quality of musicality would have to have some bearer for it to have any being at all. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. To this it can be rejoined that Socrates presumably must have some qualities, and it is far from obvious that Aristotle can have any ultimately persuasive response to this objection and his picture of the ontological dependency of qualities on substances. To this it can be rejoined that Socrates presumably must have some qualities. Yeah, I don't see that as a counter argument though. Obviously, a substance will have qualities, right? But the fact that the substance is prior to qualities, if I'm reading this correctly, making it higher, I don't think it is important, right? You know what I mean? Like, I guess an example would be if you have a business hierarchy, right? A CEO has employees, but the fact that employees exist doesn't negate the fact that the CEO is at the top of the hierarchy, right? I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I've never read the categories. So, yeah. And yeah, if you go with the CEO hierarchy thing, you know, well, nah, I'm not going to bother. Ontological dependency. Yeah, well, for present purposes, I think that the existence of qualities doesn't negate the fact that substance somehow isn't superior. Maybe I'm just a Aristotle, you know, I'm a big Aristotle fan this whole time and I just don't know it. For present purposes, however, we can leave aside the issue of the dependency hierarchy between the categories and consider more directly what Aristotle thinks in the categories. That substance is, after all, to hold that the bearer of properties is in some sense more fundamental than the properties it bears, though constitutive of the notion of substances remains merely schematic until we are told what things are in fact the bearers of properties. After all, we might, as in the example of the last paragraph, want to say that particular men like Socrates are substances, or we might want to say that quite different sorts of things, such as perhaps Platonic forms, are the substances to which everything belongs. In the categories, Aristotle subdivides the category of substance itself and makes a similar subdivision of all the other categories as well. He holds that some substances are particular, like Socrates or red rum, while others are general, such as the species of man and horse or the genus of animal. But if there is thus plurality of substances, we can in turn ask which of them is more fundamental. A Platonist would say the most general of them, the genus of animal, was closest to being substance. But Aristotle takes precisely the opposite view, holding that it is particular individuals that are fundamental, with other classificatory substances being dependent upon them, in that if there were nothing for them to classify, they would have no being at all. To be honest, this has just gone over my head. I don't know what the heck is being said right now. Thus, the metaphysical scheme of the categories is robustly particularist. It is particular beings, conspicuously particular animals, that have the most fundamental being of them all. What's interesting is, if I were to hazard a guess, a Thomist would say that um, the category that is like the number one category would be God in this conversation. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know what I'm on about. Most fundamental being of all and everything else has being in every way that depends on them. This is animals. The common sense intuitions of the non-philosopher are, after all, vindicated against the insidious challenges of rationalism. But in Aristotle's writing, whether we treat them as the sediment of a process of intellectual development or the skillfully graded presentation of a unified position, we cannot rest with such straightforward substantialism. The reason is that the favored entities of the categories, particular substances, are vulnerable to attack from another direction, from their patent susceptibility to change. In the physics, Aristotle deals with the question. Okay, so now we're getting to the metaphysics, finally. In the physics, I wonder what the author's opinion is on, like, from my understanding of materialism, right? The this guy seems to be a materialist, the author, but from my understanding of materialism, the argument that I've heard against it is that if everything is merely matter and motion, it's actually impossible to make a coherent worldview, because anything you define as something doesn't actually exist as that thing because it's an arbitrary um, uh, position, right? It's like there's no such thing as a chair, so to call something a chair is um, sort of fake, because it's merely like substantially it's not a chair. It's actually just matter formed in a way that people will call it a chair or something like that. It's completely nominal. And if you have a completely nominal position, you logically fall into like complete skepticism, or it becomes a reductio ad absurdum of some nature, or something like that. I don't know. Anyway, let's continue. I think I'm going to try and push through a little bit more and then I'm going to end the stream. Maybe if we get to book alpha, I'll end the stream because then we've read like the first 50 pages, right, of the metaphysics, and that's a good way to go. That's a good start in my opinion. So we'll maybe try and push through. If we stop somewhere else, like maybe they just yap about. Looks like the last bit is just yapping about the translation. I might skip that. I don't need to. I'm not really concerned with that. But yeah, we'll see. We'll see. In the Metaphysics, Aristotle deals with the conceptual problem of change. In the second of the three key questions that we have seen, he confronts his solution. He confronts. His solution was so successful that it takes an effort of imagination for us to perceive the severity of the problem. But it is necessary to try to do so if one is to see. I don't know why, but my internet cut out for a second there, I think. Or my headphones just necked themselves for some reason. To see why Aristotle's thought was so pressingly urgent a task, and why he was prepared to threaten the metaphysical scheme of the categories in order to be able to carry it out. The fact was that naturalistic philosophers, sympathetic to taking change seriously and making science out of the study of it, had not been able to find a fully satisfactory, convincing refutation of the arguments of Parmenides and his followers show that the change was in fact merely illusory. Show that change was in fact merely illusory. Hold on one second. I heard some clicks around my house. Hold on, give me one moment. I don't know what's going on there. These arguments were variations on a core argument which went as follows. Suppose that Socrates changes from not being musical one day to being musical the next one. We can comment on this as being a case of the musical Socrates coming into being. But then we have to defend the conceptual coherence of saying that something has come into being. But there seem to be only two ways in which something could come into being, either, that is, from something that already exists, or from nothing at all. But if the coming into being was from something that already exists, then it would have to be from the very same thing previously existing as has supposedly come into being, on the pain of the same objection arising in a different form. And in the case, there would simply not be a case of something coming into being at all. On the other hand, it is self-evidently absurd to suggest that anything could come into being from absolutely nothing at all. Thus the notion of coming into being, and with it of all change is fundamentally incoherent. That's an interesting one. I think I know that I don't know like how theologians answer this question, but I remember ages ago watching a Jay Dyer video on the transcendental argument, and he talked about a lot of things basically existing in the mind of God. So like you could think of it was called like divine conceptualism or something like that. The concept conceptualism and uh, a philosophical view that posits abstract objects like mathematical truths or logical principles are not independent entities, rather concepts in the mind of God. Oh, okay, well this doesn't have anything to do with musicality then. Yeah, either way. But yeah, like I maybe that's a way you could correct it if you were trying to be a theologian about it. So like, well, they exist in God, and then we get those attributes from God or something like that. Aristotle's solution to this difficulty is to show the way in which we should look on such changes is in terms of there being something that persists through the change and acquires some feature that it did not have before. Thus, in a way, the end product, in our case the musical Socrates, did not exist previously in a way it did, and in a way it did. This solution might seem to work well enough when a composite thing, such as the musical Socrates, comes into being. But what about the case when Socrates himself is born? He cannot be that Socrates has acquired some property since before his birth, if you prefer his conception. He did not have being at all. What happens when a substance comes into being? The answer which Aristotle resorts to is that the latter case is to a case of something composite being rearranged. Even in the case of the generation of a substance, there is something that persists and something that is added to it or taken away from it. There is something, to put it a little crudely, of which Socrates himself is a modification, just as the musical Socrates is a modification of Socrates himself. That something, says Aristotle, is matter, which had previously been distributed around Socrates' environment and has now had the form of Socrates imposed on it. This matter, thus, in some sense, underlies the very substance of Socrates himself. This is the doctrine that all particular individual entities around us are in a radical metaphysical way composites. It is fundamental to their being that they are fusions of two quite different ingredients, form and matter. This position, known as hylomorphism, how do you pronounce that, man? Hylomorphism. From the Greek words matter and form. Hylomorphism is a brilliantly bold solution to the problem of substantial generation, but it produces crisis in Aristotle's metaphysics. It's set out in the categories, for it is a central implication of the hylomorphic account of change that matter underlies the particular substances in which it is involved. But then, if matter underlies substance, how can substance be metaphysically fundamental? How can it fail to be the case that, oh my gosh, that was crazy, that the world is ultimately founded on matter? And if we assume that the matter from which Socrates is made is itself composite, as Aristotle standardly does, then the matter underlying Socrates must in turn be underlain by some more fundamental matter, so on downwards until we reach a basic kind of matter which presumably will be without any form at all. We reach what has become traditionally known as mere or primary matter, matter or primary matter. Surely the account of being and the account of change, the answers to the first two questions have shown that wholly formless matter is the ultimate foundation of the whole structure of reality. Do you know, it's kind of funny that people are arguing this, because isn't that kind of like string theory and all that sort of stuff? Like once you get past subatomic particles like protons, neutrons, and electrons, then you get down into like quarks or whatever they're called, and then below that you get like string theory, right? That would be the primary formless matter, technically, right? Maybe, maybe. I'm just throwing words out there. But this cannot be right. No doubt there are many reasons for recoiling from this possibility, but there is one that was especially important. I believe for Aristotle that this was the consequence thus derived from the answers provided for his first two questions would rule out the possibility of answering his third. If the world is ultimately made of just of formless matter, then it must ultimately be unintelligible. To accept this consequence would be a counsel of despair for any Greek philosopher. It was to deal with this absolutely central question that Aristotle wrote the Metaphysics. It has been shown that the highly morphic conception of substance, under which alone the reality of change could be defended, did not mean that the world itself is ultimately beyond our understanding. The metaphysical and conceptual foundation of the world had to be made one. Few books have been written with such an ambitious brief. In marking out the resolution of the problem of substance as the central task of the metaphysics, I do not wish to deny that there are many other topics of fundamental philosophical importance that are covered in the work, including the general nature of being, the scope and methods of philosophy, the foundations of philosophical logic, the doctrine of potentiality and actuality, Aristotelian theology, and the nature of number. All these are areas, however, viewed from the perspective of substance, and their conclusions do not undermine the claim that it is substance that is the hub of Aristotle's entire philosophical system. The whole project of philosophy, Aristotle believed, and the metaphysics presupposes, depends upon the clarification of the notion of substance. It is above all books Zeta and Eta that are devoted to the central task, and in this introduction I confine myself to suggesting a way of seeing how they resolve it. I attempt in the bibliography to direct the reader towards points of entry into the vast literature that has developed around Aristotle's views of each of the major topics of the metaphysics. It is then in Book Zeta that the problem of refining the notion of substance is first directly addressed. Aristotle's difficulty is that substance has to achieve the seemingly impossible combination of being the bottom line of the hierarchy of being and the root of the intelligibility of the world, in terms of which all else is understood. It is this requirement that rules out taking substance to be a mere matter that would seem ultimately to underlie the changeability of nature according to the teaching of the physics. In Zeta, Aristotle broaches the problem by posing two interconnected questions: what it is to be a substance, and what things are substance. He naturally takes the answer to the second of these questions to depend on that to the first. Although chapter 2 lists the candidate answers to the second question that have been favored by philosophers and by lay opinion, this list is reviewed in chapter 16. It is to the answering of the first crucial question that Zeta is overwhelmingly devoted. In chapter 3, Aristotle lists his four candidates for substancehood, his four criteria of substantiality. The list, not in Aristotle's order, is the subject or substrate, the what it was to be that, or essence of the thing whose substance is sought, the universal under which the thing falls, and the genus or kind to which the thing belongs. In the structure of the discussion, the remainder of Chapter 3 deals succinctly with the first criterion. The bulk of the whole book, chapters 4 to 12, covers in a torturous manner the second criterion, and chapters 13 to 15 and 16 are devoted to the discussion of the universal, under which that of the genus must be taken to be subsumed. Chapter 17 looks at substance from the new perspective of cause, from which, however, the central conclusions of Zeta will be upheld rather than undermined. The conclusion of Chapter 3 is one that we have already reached, that the ultimate subject, pure matter, is not a plausible candidate for substantiality, at least not in the fullest sense. There is a major traditional issue as to whether Aristotle accepts that pure matter has being at all, but even if he does, it is clear that he does not see it as providing a conception of substance that meets his requirements. In Chapter 4, we begin the discussion of the claims that of the what it was to be that thing of a thing to be its substance. Oh my gosh, can't you word that in a better way? This is just gonna be, is the rest of this just a summary of the book? Psh, I think it might be. I don't know. I think it is. I think he just decides to summarize the book in the introduction at this point. And he just discusses philosophy for 50 pages. Okay, so this whole bit has been about metaphysics. Then he talks about the structure. What does he talk about after that? Hey, this is the translation. And then, yeah, he goes over some of the terms. And then it's book alpha. And dude, this guy is a yapaholic. Brother, you've wrote the first page yourself. You're the translator. Wow. I see how it is. I see how it is. Well, I think we were on like page 28. How long has this stream been going for? I don't know, like 2 hours or something. It's crazy. Like we've been reading for like 2 hours and we've barely even got through the introduction. It's it's so silly. It's so silly. Yeah, we were past here. Here we were. Said at the start that his criterion of substantiality, Aristotle wrote that Aristotle will favor, and the discussion of it is the core of the entire metaphysics, having an importance within that work comparable to the transcendental deduction of the categories in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. The claim that the essence of something is its substance is a classic piece of metaphysical reasoning. It is deeply obscure and is wholly natural to dismiss it, as many have done, as a piece of meaningless and scholastic mumbo-jumbo, a mere exercise in juggling with a barbarous and oppressive terminology. And yet it retains a fascination, such that all attempts to kill it off seem only to lead to its recrudescence. But let us begin with its obscurity. What, if anything, does the phrase the essence of something mean? This is a translation of an equally puzzling expression in Aristotle's Greek, which could be still more literally translated just as what it was to be. It is as unnatural in Greek as it is in English to use a phrase in this way in the grammatical rule of a noun. Such a usage would be unthinkable in Plato, and it is a mark of extraordinary growth in the technical repertoire of philosophy that Aristotle makes such free employment of it, albeit in a work intended for specialist consumption. The expression has been extensively analyzed, but the key to its meaning seems to lie in the puzzling past tense embedded in it. This has affinities in expressions from Aristotle's philosophy of nature, and it suggests that the idea of what something was all along destined to become. Although Aristotle would have been aghast at almost everything written by the German Romantic philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, his only objection to that thinker's celebrated injunction to become what you are would be that it is superfluous. It is the destiny of everything to become what it is, and it is that which it was thus all along destined to be that it most really is. The medieval philosophers coined the term essentia to pick out this key idea, and its value has secured its survival into the vernaculars of modern Europe. Yeah, that's why I was saying the word essence instead of what it was to be that thing, because essence is just a easier term. Don't like be all wordy with it, you know what I mean? So Aristotle's central claim in the Metaphysics is that a thing's substance is its essence. This at least gives us something in English to work with, but it is still profoundly unclear what it can amount to. How can this equation of substance and essence be anything other than sophistry? How can it have real philosophical content at all, let alone be a revolutionary insight? We can hardly imagine T-shirts emblazoned with the slogan "Substance is essence" as an alternative to "Property is theft" or "I think therefore I am." This is the problem that is resolved through the baffling style in Chapter 4 of Zeta. The upshot character of Chapter 4 is that what it means to say that substance is essence is just this, that what is ontologically fundamental as that on whose being the being of everything else depends is also conceptually prior, as that in terms of which everything else is to be explained. It is the equation of substance and essence that solves the problem at the heart of Aristotle's entire system, by reintegrating the being of the world with our need to comprehend it. But why should the essence of something be regarded as what is most intelligible about it? Surely we might think that the surface properties of things are familiar and reasonably manageable, but their essence are recondite and obscure, hidden from ordinary view, and available only to more penetrating scrutiny of science. Surely it was the triumph of centuries of scholarly labor that discovered that the essence of water is H2O. Well, Aristotle's reason for holding that essence is, as he puts it, prior in thought more intelligible. that is than anything else rests on a distinction he draws, though it is not specifically present in Zeta 4, between what is intelligible to us and what is intelligible in itself. In the case of water and H2O, is indeed not one that Aristotle would be at home with, but we can use it to make his point. Aristotle would say that the surface properties of water, its wetness and coldness and so forth, are intelligible to us in that we do not have to take much of an effort to understand them. They come naturally to us. The essential structure of water as a combination of hydrogen and oxygen that we label H2O is, by contrast, intelligible in itself, not because it is easy and natural for us to understand, but because when, after much labor, we do come to understand it, we understand it in a far more real and profound way than we have previously understood its mere surface characteristics. The essence, H2O, is really unintelligible, whereas wetness and water is merely familiar. The understanding of the scientist is the benchmark against which that of all others is measured. But if we accept that scientific understanding, if we can but get it, oh my gosh, this is so wordy now. This is still the introduction, but it's so wordy. Let's try this again. But even if we accept that scientific understanding, if we can but get it, is understanding in the fullest sense. Yeah, okay. So it's like the essence is the thing that when it's essence in itself, it's like when it is understood in its most purest sense, is what I'm getting. Even if it's hard to understand, the most purest description of something is its essence, if that makes sense. That's what I'm getting out of this, at least. And also, hello one viewer. I don't know who you are, but thank you for watching, because you are my only viewer at the moment. So it's just you and me, pal. We're reading this together. Why should we think that it is the essence of something that is thus the object of scientific understanding? Aristotle's answer is clear. The essence of a thing is that which is most intelligible about it, because it is the essence of the thing that is caught in the definition of it. Thus the notion of definition comes in turn to play a crucial part in Aristotle's position. In chapters 4 to 6, Aristotle seeks to show that it is only the essence of something that can be defined. His arguments are profoundly difficult, not least because of textual uncertainties, but a central consideration seems to be that for something to be definable, it must have a certain kind of unity. It must be, in some deep way, a single thing and not a combination of more than one thing. And Aristotle argues that it is only essences that are definable in this way. This great stress on the notion of unity is a criterion for definability. As a criterion for definability will expose Aristotle to the objection that a definition itself is inherently a combination. Water, for instance, must be defined as hydrogen and oxygen in a ratio of 2 to 1. And it is this difficulty that he deals with in the extraordinary discussion in chapters 10 to 12. But for the moment we can concentrate on the claim of chapter 4, that essences and essences alone are definable unities. From this, it follows, I think if I were to hazard a guess at the angle Aristotle will take in response to this objection with the definition thing, and a definition can be a combination, but a combination can also be united, right? technically. But I don't know, we'll find out, because obviously you have combinations of many things that are, whatchamacallit, combinations of multiple characteristics that become unified in one thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the thing in question isn't unified if it's a composite. I don't know. From this, it follows that to be a substance is to be an essence, but and nothing but an essence, to be a pure essence, something that is with only essential features. Thus Aristotle has arrived at an answer to the first of the two questions of Zeta. He has shown what is to be a substance. He now has three remaining tasks: that of clarifying the many remaining obscurities in the answer that he has given, that of rejecting the remaining candidate criteria of my headphones just like farted on themselves and died. I think what's happening is because I don't have any audio playing, my headphones assume that they've just been left unattended for, so they just turn themselves off. So, yeah, I don't know what to do about that. I'll fix that some other time. He now has three remaining tasks: that of clarifying the remaining obscurities in the answer that he has given, that of rejecting the remaining candidate criteria of substantiality, the universal and the genus, and that of answering his second question of what things then are substances. It is the last of these tasks that he addresses in the discussion of chapter 4. He announces with an extraordinary answer on the essence criterion of substantiality. It turns out that the substances that underpin the world are no longer particular individuals of the categories, but the species to which they belong. It is now Socrates and red rum that are fundamental. It is not now Socrates and red rum that are fundamental, but the species of man and horse. This is indeed a radical shift, whereas before Aristotle seemed to be defining a notion of thinghood which was deeply in tune with common sense. He seems now to have moved to a conception which is wholly at odds with it, under which the fundamental building blocks of the world, on whose being that of everything else depends, are now entire species of animals. It is important to see the magnitude of this change. There are many possible objections to it, to be sure, but the most fundamental charge that Aristotle must rebut is that in moving to the claim that it is species that are substances, the doctrine, as I shall call it, of special substance, Aristotle has effectively relapsed into Platonism. That is, his view is not to be distinguished from, in the final analysis, from the doctrine of universal substance, that Aristotle himself took to be the heart of the theory of forms. Aristotle will seek to show that the doctrine of special substance is not equated with that of universal substance, and does not differ from its fatal flaws. In the section of Zeta, in which he attacks universal substance, we will look at his argument in due course, but even at this stage it should be mentioned that Aristotle thinks that species have two crucial features that they share with particulars and do not share with universals. These features are those which Aristotle calls thisness and separability. The meaning and relevance of these two features has been much discussed. Separability is a term that Aristotle uses in a wide variety of ways in his system, but in this context, it seems to be less central to Aristotle's point than the notion of thisness. Thisness is something that is a thing, is something that a thing has by dint of being determinate in a particular kind of way. There are just some things that one can point to and refer to as this, without thereby exposing oneself to the question of this what. It is clear for Aristotle that individual horses and men have this feature. Particularity is a kind of thisness. If I point to Socrates and say this one, my reference is clear, but particularity does not exhaust thisness. A thing can be this without being a particular. A thing can be this by being a species of particulars. If we are deciding to say, on the purchase of a pet dog, I can point to a breed in the catalogue and say, I like this one. Here again, my reference is clear. I'm not indicating a predilection for the particular dog of the illustration, but for the no less determinate species to which it belongs. Species too have thisness, and genera do not. I cannot point to an animal and say this one. Refer to the genus of animal against that of plants. The thisness criterion clearly brackets species with particulars and not with universals. This is going a bit over my head. I'm sure if I read the categories of the physics, it wouldn't be, but I didn't, so here we are. I will say this, I know the scholastic Duns Scotus actually came up with the Latin term like haexiety, which is just another way of saying thisness.
Haexiety.
Haexiety. Yeah, this is thisness, and I think Duns Scotus came up with that one. So that's neat. That's neat. Species then are entities unitary in a certain way, whose essences exhaust their natures, in other words, substances. This is a remarkable if unstable position. It is remarkable because it assigns a fundamental metaphysical role to a certain subset of natural kinds. It steers a middle way between the ascription of a profound ontological significance to the commonplace entities of our experience and the Platonic insistence that reality must lie in a transcendent realm of purely intelligible entities. It is unstable for two reasons. Do you know, reading the Ethics by Aristotle kind of is like jumping back out at me, because one of his big things in the Ethics is like the middle way, you know, and it sounds like, I know I'm reaching here, but it sounds like he's doing a middle way here. It's like, well, the extremes are too far, let's go for the middle. Yeah. Okay, why is it unstable? Why is it unstable, Mr. Translator? Mr. Translator, in your introduction. First, it is far from clear that species can be defended against the objections that Aristotle himself brings against Platonic universal substance. And secondly, the roles played by the concepts of unity and definition on account of essence may well turn out to be incompatible. Aristotle will confront these two difficulties in the later chapters of Zeta. But in the text we have read before, we come to those chapters, we find a 3-chapter section which has in many ways the feel of being an insertion at some point in the history of the text. In this section, Aristotle appears to be equating the species to which an entity belongs with the form that is an ingredient in the composite nature of that entity, and in form is to be equated with the species. They are often referred to by the same word in Greek. Then, form is also to be equated with substance. And since form has played a crucial part in the highly morphic account of change, and in Aristotle's natural philosophy in general, the discussion of substance is yet more fully tied into other features of Aristotle's system. It is always important, of course, to be as clear as possible about the distinction between Aristotelian immanent form, which can only, or at any rate, only normally exist in conjunction with matter, and Platonic separable form, which can only have dealings with matter through the weak relationship of the participation in it of things which with the latter in them. To mark the distinction, I'm guessing it's like a distinction between like a book and a number, right? You can have something that has two-ness because there's two of them, but it's less material. I'm guessing it's going to be about material things based in material reality and not um, to mark this distinction, I follow the conventional practice of capitalizing the Platonic but not the Aristotelian conception of form versus form. So every time Plato is going to be mentioned, it's going to be capital F, and when it's a Platonic form, but when it's a regular form, it's just lowercase f. Chapters 10 to 12 offer a subtle defense of the claim that a definition, and thus the object of a definition, has an intrinsic unity, something that we have seen to be required by Aristotle's whole position on substance. The problem that Aristotle confronts is that a definition seems necessarily to be something involving parts. To define A just is to say that A is, by definition, B with features C and D. In the case with which Aristotle works, that of definition by genus and differentia. A species is defined in terms of its genus and its differentia, the feature that distinguishes it from other species in the same genus. Thus, the species man may be defined as featherless, two-footed animal. Ah, yeah, like everyone knows who's like heard a bit of philosophy, the joke about um the chicken being a featherless biped. Like if you pluck a chicken, it's technically a featherless biped, and Diogenes made that point to Plato. Um, yeah, I thought that was always funny. Greeks are full of wisdom, so civilized. No, man, it's a featherless biped. Why is this so low quality, man? Behold a man. Yeah, very funny. Very funny. Ha ha ha. There are, to be sure, problems enough in connection with the notion of differentia in general, but they need not concern us in the present context. The problem is that of how A can be a unity if it is really B and C. How can man be a unity if it is really animal and say two-footed? The details of Aristotle's solution to this difficulty are far from being beyond dispute, but its general thrust seems to rest on the distinction between two kinds of parts that something may have. A thing can have parts which are prior in understanding and or parts that are posterior in understanding. A part is a part that is prior in understanding is a part that the understanding of which must precede the understanding of the entity as a whole. Thus Aristotle says, the letters of a syllable are prior parts of it. Since one cannot understand a syllable, say A, without first understanding its constituent parts, A and E. By contrast, a part that is posterior in understanding is a part that can only be understood when the thing of which it is a part is already understood. Aristotle's example is a section of a circle. One cannot understand what a section of a circle is unless one already understands a circle. Given this distinction, Aristotle can now make two further claims. The first is that the parts of a definition are posterior to the definition as a whole. The second is that having posterior parts does not compromise something's unity in the way that having prior ones does. This is sort of what I was saying before. When he was bringing up this issue of H2O, like, oh, well, if H2O is defined as a combination of hydrogen and oxygen particles in a 2-to-1 ratio, doesn't that mean that there is no essence to H2O? Aristotle seems to be answering that here, where it's like, well, it depends on if it's prior or not. And I'm gonna be honest, I'm kind of losing it. I'm kind of not I'm kind of not understanding it at this point. If these two further claims are allowed, then he can feel that he has met the objection that his fundamental entities are radically divided. The discussion of the unity of the definition has been hailed as the first sustained discussion in the discipline of philosophical logic, and interpretation is cloaked in controversy. Ooh. It is impossible to discuss it in any depth in the present introduction, nor is the account that I have given any more than the crudest of initial summaries. It may well be that the unity of definition is not something that can be defended in the way that Aristotle requires, and that it is in fact the Achilles heel of his system, but one can only admire the candor with which Aristotle recognizes the problem, and the energy and ingenuity with which he takes it on. I do not know what candor means.
Candor.
Candor. Quality of being open and honest. Frankness. Yeah, that's true. He is no less ingenious in his confrontation of the objection that special substance must itself be a kind of universal substance, and thus in effect constitute a relapse on Aristotle's part into Platonism. The objection can be formulated straightforwardly enough as follows. Aristotle says that a species is a substance, but a species inherently has several members. One-member species, though perfectly possible, are the exception and clearly not necessary. But anything that has several members must be universal. That is just what it is to be a universal, to be constituted of or apply to a range of separate things. So Aristotle must be saying that substance is universal. Pace, the teaching of the categories. I've never seen pace used in that way. So more. With due respect to something and its opinions, used to respect polite disagreement.
Pacey.
Pacey. Narrative history, Pacey, some theorists, is by no means dead. I see. Pacey is the universal. Pacey, the teaching of the categories. And be a Platonist after all. Aristotle's response to this has to be reconstructed from this text, and the most promising attempt to reconstruct it has him claiming that the key second stage of the argument is mistaken. The second stage says that anything under which several things fall or may fall is a universal, but the counterclaim is that this is not so. Something is not a universal just if several things fall under it, but only if it is also predicated of several things. A species is something under which several things fall, but it is not predicated of several things. Therefore, it is not a universal. What does this mean? The idea is that uh, the idea is that B can only be predicated of A if I can have discriminatory understanding of A, can pick A out from all other objects in the world without already knowing that it is B. If I cannot know what B is without knowing what is A, then I cannot predicatively say that B is A. A prediction or predication on this view cannot be analytic, and then it can be said that anything that is a member of a species is something that is indeed only discriminately picked out on the basis of knowledge that it is a member of that species. And so it can turn out that species is substance without being universal. Again, like, I'm sure this makes sense if you've actually read enough philosophy, but I know like the surface of what it means for there to be a universal and a particular. This is going over my head. I'm sorry. I have no idea what's going on anymore. I think once we get to the structure and composition of the metaphysics, I might call it there because I've been going for like quite a few hours already, just non-stop reading. And it's hurting my eyes, unfortunately, because I do not have a whatchamacallit, like glasses or anything to make it easier on me. Where were we? Here we are. This is, of course, only one way of interpreting the treatment of universal objection to special substance that Aristotle provides in the later chapters of Zeta. Once again, it may well turn out that the objection is insuperable. There's a new word. Insuperable. What does this mean?
Insuperable.
Impossible to overcome. I see. So that Aristotle's position, even in its own terms, is self-contradictory. But once again, the extraordinary wealth of debate has flourished around this, and his contentions, his testimony to suggestive power of his insights, seems that Aristotle has raised an issue that cannot be ignored by anyone who's prepared to take seriously the notion that both particular and universal items can have being. And even phenomenalists about universals, the notion that there is an important distinction between being a universal and being universally predictable is a pregnant topic for discussion. I did not know you could use pregnant in that way. Hey, I'm learning so much. The upshot of this slightest introductions of Zeta 3 to 16 is that by the end of that passage, Aristotle has reached and defended an entirely new metaphysical position. We can see him trying to achieve an intermediate position between what he sees as the categories of materialism and Platonism, as he was in the categories, but whereas in the categories it was particular individuals in whom being primarily rested, that honor is now given to the species to which they belong. This position is, as we have seen, exposed, but if it can be maintained, there are great advantages that can flow from it. It represents a successful resolution of three questions we saw at the start of the fundamental importance of Aristotle, especially deals with the difficulties created by hylemorphic doctrine of change. And in addition, through the connection between the notions of species and of form, it connects Aristotle's metaphysics in the strongest possible way with his philosophy of nature, and in particular his teleological account of the general operation of the natural world. Teleology is like purpose. So it's basically his metaphysics. All he's saying here is like, finally something I understand. All he's saying here is basically that his metaphysics, if you actually grant it as correct, is able to pretty confidently, pretty succinctly give a doctrine of purpose. Or, in other words, if you understand the metaphysics, you can understand the uh, ethics of Aristotle, which again points to the fact that I have been reading Aristotle in the wrong direction because I read ethics before I read metaphysics. So there's that. The doctrine of special substance is one of the most trenchant and striking of all positions adopted by the metaphysical system builders of philosophical history. And yet, for all its attractions, there is reason to think that the doctrine had been abandoned even before the work that makes up the metaphysics had been completed. For it seems clearly to be the case that in Book Eta tries to move back to a position more or less like that of the categories, only suitably updated, in which the role of substance is again played by composite particulars rather than species. The conclusion reached in Chapter 6 of Eta is that the composite particulars are not after all underlain by matter persisting through change in a way that is incompatible with their being the fundamental realities, Thus Aristotle has returned to the safer ground of the categories, but to do so he must meet the objection to the particular substances based on the hylomorphic account of change, which was, as we have seen, the original reason for abandoning the categories position. It is far from clear, as always, that Aristotle can successfully do this, but most promising construal of his attempt to do so is offered by M. L. Gill. She takes Aristotle to be arguing that there is still something in a composite entity that has persisted through the change that has brought that entity into being, so the Parmenidean dilemma does not arise, but that persistent thing has in the composite only potential being. This means that the part of the composite having in the composite only potential being through the actual being when not in it cannot be more fundamental than the composite that has being in actuality. So particulars are once again freed to be both composite and substantial. This is a highly ingenious reconstruction of Aristotle's new position, though it may well be too generous to him. And it also has the merit of highlighting the connection between the discussion of substance in terms of matter and the particular and the universal, and the discussion of substance in terms of actuality and potentiality that begins in the book Theta and is extended in important new directions in the book Lambda. It may well be that Aristotle's second position on substance in the metaphysics, that of Book Eta, is no more successful than his first, from which it would seem to be a kind of retreat. But the vigor and tenacity with which the second position is defended is on par with that of the first. The notion of the potential persistent is no less fruitful for philosophical discussion than that of the unity of posterior parts, or the contrast between universality and universal predictability. All these positions reflect Aristotle's attempt to reconcile his three fundamental desiderata. Desiderata? I've never heard this word before.
Desideratum.
Desideratum. Something that is needed or wanted. Huh. There you go. That the world should be grounded in a certain class of really existing things, and that such things would be susceptible to change, and that such things would be in principle available for our comprehension. We are at liberty to abandon any one of these three claims. We can take the world to have no real existence independent of ourselves in anything like Aristotle's sense. We can acquiesce the concession that change is in a certain way illusory, or we give up the hope of ever coming to know the world in its real nature. Each of these abandonments has been extensively defended by whole schools of philosophers. That is true. Like, a lot of people don't hold all three positions at the same time, which I think it, to me, makes the most sense, right? I think, to me, holding those positions is almost in a way necessary for the world to be coherent in a meaningful way. But, we'll learn more as we read along, I guess. But each of them is to a greater or lesser extent repugnant to common sense. If we wish then to save appearances, we must try and find an answer to each of Aristotle's fundamental questions. And if we are committed to this project, it is far from clear that we can carry it out in any better than Aristotle has done, or that there is nothing that we can learn from the ambitious program at the heart of metaphysics. I have attempted to say something about the central strand of argument in the Metaphysics. It's very far indeed from being the only position that the text adopts. It is not for nothing that the work has been hailed as the foundation of an entire branch of philosophy, and it could be claimed that there is no major problem of traditional metaphysics that is not to some extent covered in its pages. For all that, however, it is no mere encyclopedia of metaphysics. It does not have a structure, albeit submerged it does have a structure, albeit submerged beneath its surface incrustations, and the huge range of issues that it covers is presented, however remotely, from the perspective of substance. We might say that substance is the sun in the solar system of the metaphysics, and the other issues, the planets, the comets, the asteroids, and meteors. While it is not possible to look in detail at all the issues in the work, it might be helpful to offer an account of how the presentation of them coheres. In doing this, we can also confront and assess a highly plausible claim that the work, in one way or another, a compilation, perhaps by Aristotle himself, perhaps by his contemporary assistants, perhaps by his immediate philosophical heirs, and perhaps by editors of a much later age, of some of the most important metaphysical writings circulating in the Lyceum at the heights of his creative phase. Wow. Would you look at that, Lois? We've read basically a half of the introduction, which is just ridiculous. It's redonkulous, honestly. Like, this is a dense introduction. I think it's necessary because obviously if you're working with a book like the Metaphysics, it's going to be really tough to kind of get the entire metaphysics across at once. You know what I mean? Like, you can't really write a small introduction for a work like this, especially in modern times, because most people, when they pick up a book, the expectation that the author has is that you haven't read any other book. So it covers everything holistically, which I'm thankful for because I have not read the categories or the physics, so reading this is helpful. But I think next week I will tackle the rest of the introduction, which there isn't much left to go. And that's a stream for another day. But, overall, I think it's been good. I've got one awesome viewer who's stuck with me through most of this. But I think I'm going to end the stream there. So yeah, thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Catch ya. I am Sinner. Thank you for watching.